Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture for week 7. So this week our topic is interview former students. Okay, so for today's lecture, we're going to start with a warm-up. Then we're going to review last week's topic, which was graphical user interfaces. Today's topic, interview former students. And for grammar, we're going to look at simple past tense questions. Okay, and then we're going to do some practice and we're going to do some review. So your review this week is going to be for the midterm test next week. Okay, so let's start with our warm-up. So first, watch this short video of a job interview. A job interview is when an employer interviews a prospective employee for a new job. The employer, the interviewer, must ask the prospective employee, the interviewee, many questions to decide if they are suitable to take the job. Listen carefully to the grammatical forms of the questions asked and to the grammatical forms of the answers. Listen and think about how past tense is used in the questions. Okay, so you can click on this link here and it will take you to the video. Now, I want you to pause the lecture. So pause the lecture and watch the video now, and then come back to the lecture. Okay, now an employer is the company that you work for. The company or the boss is the employer. Okay, employer. And the employee is the worker. So the person who works for the company or for the employer is the employee. All right. Now, an interviewer is the person who asks the questions in the interview. And the interviewee is the person who answers the questions. Okay. So here we have a fun picture. This is the employer and the interviewer. These are the interviewees. They're the prospective employees. Prospective means they're looking for a job. They're looking. Okay, so for a warm-up activity, I want everyone to ask me a question about my past in the comment section of this video. To make this activity a bit more difficult and fun, no one can ask me the same question. So you all have to ask me different questions. Okay? For example, you could ask, where did you grow up? Or, have you ever seen a kangaroo? Or, were there many trees at your university? After you ask your question, I will answer it and ask you a question in the comment section. Okay, and I want you to answer my question too. All right. Okay, let's review last week's content. So we're going to do the review a bit differently this week. I want you to message one of the other students in your class on WhatsApp. Ask them to tell you one thing they learned last week and tell them one thing that you learned. Okay, for example, you can message them, "What did you learn about infinitives last week?" And you can tell them, "I learned that graphical unit user interfaces in the future will use virtual reality." Okay, now in the practicum session, I'm going to ask some students to read out their questions and answers. Okay. So here is an example of a question in the simple past tense. What was your favorite subject in high school? Why? So my favorite subject in high school was literature or English, because I enjoy reading books and talking about stories. Okay? And I also enjoy writing stories and reading and writing poems. So that's why English was my favorite subject. So in the practicum session, I'm going to ask you this question, some students. So have a think about the answer to that one. Okay, here is another review question. So for this one, you have to decide if the answer is true or false. Okay, so you can do this by yourself, and in the practicum session, I'm going to check to see if you got it right. Okay, let's start with this passage here. Poland was 24 years old when he completed his higher national diploma in computing support in Jakarta. In his courses, he studied with over 50 students from all over Indonesia. His friend Paulina helped him the most in his studies. After graduating, he worked for a company providing support services for over 18 months. All right, so I'm going to be the interviewer, and I'm going to ask some questions for Pauline. So my questions are, what did you complete your diploma in? Where did you complete your studies? How old were you when you graduated? What job did you do after graduating? Were there many students in your course? Who helped you to study the most? Okay, and Poland's answers. I did my diploma in computing support. In Jakarta, I met so many people there. 24. I worked for a company that provided support services. Yes, there were 50. My friend Paulina, we became friends after we noticed we had very similar names. Okay, now you'll notice in these answers that some information is extra. The question didn't ask for some of the information here, like I met so many people there and we became friends after we noticed we had very similar names. So if we look at question 2 and 6, where did you complete your studies? In Jakarta. I met so many people there. So this is extra information. And question 6, who helped you to study the most? My friend Paulina. And then we have this extra information. We became friends after we noticed we had very similar names. So this interview with Pollen is an informal interview. It's not for a job. It's just two students talking. So in a more informal interview, we want there to be some extra information that makes it a bit more interesting and provides some more opinion or detail or description. Okay? So in any conversation, when someone asks a question, we're going to give them more information if it's an informal context. Okay, let's look at the simple past tense again. So past tense is used to discuss actions in the past. Here we have an affirmative example. She studied computers for 5 years. Here we have a negative example. She did not study computers for 5 years. And here we have the interrogative form or a question form. Did she study computers for 5 years? So in the simple past, we have the subject, and then we have the past form of the verb. Okay? The subject, the past form. Now let's look at questions in a bit more detail. Okay, so you can put subject, verb, subject, verb. Okay. So, to ask a question in the simple past tense, we use did plus subject plus root or base verb. Okay, for example, did George win the first prize or the second prize? Okay, so here we have did, here we have the subject George, and here we have the base or root verb. Okay. Did you study graphical user interfaces last week? Okay, subject, sorry, did verb, subject, and the root verb. Okay, we can also put how, where, why, who, whose, or what before did in our questions to make the circumstances or situation clear. For example, okay, how did you go with your practice questions? Were they hard? Where did you answer your final task question? At home? Why did you write about windows in your answers? Who did you show your answers to? Just Miss Mona or Mr. Joel? What part of the lesson content did you find most difficult? Whose answer did you like the best? Okay, so this part, you will notice in these questions that some of them have a comma near the end and then kind of a second question. Now, we call this part at the end a question tag. Okay? A question tag lets us add a bit more information to our question. Okay, so we can make it a bit clearer what we're asking. Okay, so to do that, we put a comma and then we add some information at the end before the question mark. Okay, now when we ask a question with the verb to be, we don't need to use did. Instead, we use the to be verbs was or were plus subject. For example, was Mr. Joel clear in the lecture? Were there many interruptions in the bandwidth connection in the practicum session? Okay, so here we have the to be verb was, the subject, Mr. Joel, the to be verb were, and the subject, interruptions. Okay, now sometimes there will be some words between was and were and the subject. Okay, we can also use what, where, why, who, whose, and how with to be verbs in simple past tense questions. For example, what were the hardest questions? Why was the program so difficult? How was Windows the easiest to use? Who was the best student today? Whose answer was the best? Okay, so sometimes, again, we will have some words between the what, where, why, and the was and were verb, like in this example here. Okay, so now we have some more examples of questions about the past. So we can order these questions into different types of questions according to different information. So when we're asking about quantity, we can ask, how many days a week did you study? How much programming did you do? When we're asking about time, when did you study communication? Or what time did you study communication? Asking about people, who taught you math? Whose classes did you most enjoy? Asking about things, what made you choose computing support? What did you like most? Asking about actions, what did you do on Friday? What happened on Monday morning? Okay, for practice 1, I want you to read this passage, and then I want you to create 5 questions to ask Pauline about her first term, and then write Pauline's answers. Okay, so you need to use the simple past tense rules that we looked at today and refer only to the information in the passage for the questions. But for Pauline's answers, you should add extra informal information. And in the practicum session, I'm going to ask you to screen share your answers and questions, okay? So for practice 2, I want you to create 5 questions asking another student in your class about lesson content from weeks 1 to 7. Use the past tense rules. And in the practicum session, you're going to interview your classmates. Okay, so the midterm exam is next week. You need to review that at home. Good luck with that. Okay, that's today's lecture. Thank you, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you all in the practicum sessions.